Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our AP Environmental Science virtual classroom. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Ms. Fassler, and I teach apes at Marshfield High School in Marshfield, Wisconsin. So guess what? We're going to start with the warm-up and go over the question that you looked at yesterday with Dr. Sowell. When you finished up Unit 4, you had this great question on soil testing, which really nice example of some experimental design. So let's see how you did. The first prompt asked you to identify and describe, and we'll dig into how the rubric addresses that in a minute. You needed to look at both one chemical soil test and one physical test, and then relate those to how you would present some sustainable agriculture recommendations to the farmer that brought that soil sample into you. You are working at your dream summer job as a soil tester for a cooperative extension service. So that's where people are going to bring their soil samples. You're going to give them feedback and make some recommendations. So let's take a look at the chemical tests. I think that most students went with sort of those classic 4 chemical tests we often do on a soil sample pH, and then the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. Note that even though I had to describe in order to get the 1 point for that, the rubric indicates that the name if I say I'm going to test for nitrogen, that really is kind of a description. There's not much else I have to say about that. In terms of the physical tests, there's a lot of options there. I think the most common was probably a student saying, I want to test the soil texture in some way. And notice there's a couple of different ways you could have described the soil texture, and that term, rather than using soil texture. And a description of the test itself would be looking for the relative amounts of sand, silt, or clay. Other common tests, the water holding capacity, the permeability. You can see there's a pretty broad list there. Excuse me. The next third point here then was, what kind of recommendations would you make based on these results? And you can see things like, oh, if my soil was low in nitrogen, one of those tests I did, perhaps my recommendation is to plant a legume or a nitrogen fixer. Maybe I would want to add either sulfur or lime the soil, depending on my pH, to neutralize it. And you're actually going to look at sustainable agriculture practices tomorrow, so these will make a lot more sense to you then. The next one was looking at explaining one advantage and one disadvantage of an inorganic commercial fertilizer. Let's just make sure we're clear what they mean by that. And although the question doesn't ask me to compare it to an organic fertilizer, let's just make sure you're clear on what we mean there. That inorganic commercial fertilizer it does not have decaying organic matter or humus in it. I purchased it. It was manufactured in a chemical manufacturing plant. I go to a store and I purchase that, and it's a salt that I apply to my field or my lawn if I'm going to fertilize my lawn. And then when I water that, or when it rains, that salt goes into solution. And so many of the advantages of that relate to understanding what exactly an inorganic commercial fertilizer is. So it's pretty easy to just go into a store and buy that big bag of fertilizer and transport it and store it and then apply it to my field when I need it. And once that goes into solution, those nutrients are readily available. That salt goes into aqueous solution, and now plants can take that up when they take up water. Disadvantages of that have to do with the fact, like I think probably one direction a lot of students went was that runoff and that issue of eutrophication or over nutrient enrichment of surface waters. You could have talked about the fact that it doesn't add anything to increase the texture or bulk of the soil structure. And again, if I would compare that, it makes more sense if I think, if I wanted to add an organic fertilizer, that would be compost or animal manure. When I work that in, it's going to change the structure of my soil. It's going to increase the water holding capacity, prevent erosion or runoff. adding this inorganic salt that goes into solution doesn't have any of those advantages. There's a lot of harm with actually harming the plant, a lot of potential to over fertilize and put the wrong concentration down. And then I just want to mention this one, even though greenhouse gases aren't assessed on our exam, the nitrogen cycle and air pollution are. So remember that in the microbial, when I put that fertilizer on my field, the soil microbes can convert that form of nitrogen into nitrous oxide that can then enter the atmosphere where it is a potent greenhouse gas. Letter C was to describe 2 soil conservation practices to decrease erosion. Again, you're going to really dig into this a little bit more tomorrow, so I'm just going to give you a second to look at that, and you'll go back and review that more in sustainable agriculture tomorrow. And then letter D was 3 points for looking at, actually 4 points. We have to list a biome that's rich in humus. We have to describe how that humus originated and provide 2 ways that humus improves conditions for plant growth. So notice that the biomes that were accepted were not just forest, and we're going to point that out in a minute. I could say a deciduous forest or a temperate forest. I could say a temperate rainforest, or I could say a grassland, a temperate grassland, like a prairie, and all these different terms we have for prairies. How that humus originated was really just the decomposition and buildup of organic matter. In a deciduous forest, we use that term leaf litter, I think, when we looked at the worm invasion. So all of that leaf litter and plant and animal material decompose, and those nutrients are then released. How it improves soil condition, it increases the fertility. And this is where I was going with the previous question. This humus is like that compost that I might add on purpose to increase the nutrient concentration in my soil. And the humus gives me all those advantages of holding water and retaining water and preventing erosion. The other thing I wanted to point out here was that tropical rainforest is not an acceptable biome. We're going to explain that in a little bit when we look at slash and burn agriculture and tropical rainforest. So if you're questioning why not a tropical rainforest, just hold on to that thought. So where are we going today? Well, we finished Unit 5, Unit 4, and today we're moving into Unit 5, and guess what? We're going to focus on describing or explaining an environmental concept, process, or model. And just like in that last homework FRQ, you really dug in to the experimental design. A lot of what we do in Unit 5 lends itself to proposing and justifying an environmental problem. We're still not forgetting about this. We have 3 units left to review, so we'll have plenty of time to go over both of those specific portions unique to each of the 2 questions. I just wanted to take a minute and mention a little bit about organizing yourself for the national exam. It's still 3 weeks away, but as you're watching the videos, I want to make sure you know, that you can use notes on the exam. While you're sitting at home, you can use any notes or resources that you've generated, and the College Board has put together a really great document that gives you some tips for how to take an open notebook test. We certainly don't want you to have this impression that it's going to be a piece of cake because it's open notes. Oftentimes students get sort of this false sense of security. So as you're watching the videos and you're going through this review process, keep that end game in mind. We are taking a 2-question free response exam. It'd be a little bit different if we were taking multiple choice questions on the exam. How I organize my notes and what I include in them might be a little bit different. I certainly need facts and details to put some meat on my description and explanations, but keep in mind how you're going to be assessed on the content and how you're going to organize your notes as you're going through the lectures, that you really want to start visualizing what that test day is going to look like when you sit down with those notes in front of you, and how to make the most out of that, as well as manage your time. So we're moving into Unit 5 on land and water use. This unit explores human activities that disrupt ecosystems. This is the part of the APES curriculum that can tend to get a little depressing to students, because there's a lot of ways that we can negatively disrupt ecosystems. And that's why we really try to spend a lot of time focusing on the second part of this learning objective in providing strategies to mitigate or reduce or solutions to solve some of the impacts that humans are having. In our discussion today, in the first of 3 lessons of Unit 5, there's a lot of learning targets in this unit, so we're going to spread it out over the next 3 days. Today, we're really going to focus on how will Earth systems and processes provide for future generations. And in order to do that, we're going to shift the order a little bit, and we're going to kick off with learning target number 12, an introduction to sustainability. We'll go into tragedy of the commons, and just to start to kind of introduce how agriculture systems might positively or negatively impact the environment, how human activities through agriculture might impact the environment. And the big ideas that we're going to focus on are how species interact with their environment, humans interacting with the natural world, and the way we use resources, and obviously this big idea on sustainability and the challenges that we face in ensuring that we are leaving resources for future generations. So the term sustainability itself, let's start with kind of a review of what we mean by that and sustainable resource use. If you think about it, it's inevitable that we as humans are going to alter natural ecosystems as we locate, extract, and process different resources, whether those are energy resources, different mineral resources, renewable resources. We have some impact. Our activities are going to have an impact. And in fact, scientists have now coined the term Anthropocene to describe the current geologic epoch that we're in, where it's really human activities that are being the dominant influence on the environment and climate. Versus if you look at what we've done over the last week or two, we looked at natural selection and how over a period of time, organisms can adapt to a rapidly changing environment. And we just finished up that Unit 4 on geologic processes. So we know how our Earth should function when things are working well. We know that there are changes and impacts, natural impacts all the time. But I guess the idea of sustainability to me really implies this balance. And the term really kind of started first being used around Earth Day, and how coincidental, we are celebrating 50 years of Earth Day tomorrow. Everybody wear your tie-dye. And so it's like a balancing act. We have to extract resources. We have to grow food. We have to have energy. We have to have houses and other things. But how do we do that in such a way that we ensure that future generations are going to have access to those same life-supporting processes that our planet naturally does to supply us with these natural resources? So 50 years of Earth Day. Earth Day was kind of the brainchild of a Wisconsin US Senator Gaylord Nelson. And the University of Wisconsin currently has the Nelson Study for Environmental Science, a fabulous institute that honors the work that he did. So as we start digging into sustainability and sustainable resource use, I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on these environmental indicators. Think of it, if you go to the doctor for a physical, the very couple of first simple, easy things they do, they take your temperature, your pulse, and your blood pressure. These environmental indicators are the pulse and the temperature and the blood pressure of our planet. They're these key indicators of kind of how well we're doing on using resources in a sustainable way. So let's just look at a couple of those to get us thinking about the idea of sustainability. Certainly one of the key environmental indicators is population growth. We simply have a lot of people that are going to need access to life-supporting Earth processes and Earth resources and all these ecosystem services that provide for human life on our planet. And so we obviously face challenges with sustainability when we have more and more people wanting to access the available resources. One reason that scientists have coined the term Anthropocene, and this really kind of drives home that point, is the drastic increase in extinctions across all different taxonomic groups relative to the typical background or normal rate of species extinction. This is a high blood pressure that our planet is calling out to us that there's something wrong. Certainly, we cannot ignore the indicator of increasing levels of carbon dioxide concentrations at rates and up to levels that we have not seen throughout 800,000 years of geologic climate, recreating of geologic climate, and all of the direct and indirect implications of increasing CO2 and a warmer planet. Probably one of the key indicators of a warming planet is one of the first things climate scientists alerted us to in the 1970s when they first started publishing papers on what they predicted were going to be some of the consequences of increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that is both the number of severe weather events and the severity, the intensity of those severe weather events. And if you kind of picture a little bit of a trend line through here, you can see that we are drastically increasing the cost to our future generations. We are leaving them with an economic system that may not be able to absorb the cost of all these drastic changes that we're causing. So again, a little bit doom and gloom, kind of to lay out as we review those core ideas of sustainability. And that leads us directly into a review of this concept of tragedy of the commons. You may remember talking about this. You may have done a little fishing activity on it. It's this idea that was first proposed by Garrett Hardin that individuals will often use shared resources with their own self-interest in mind, not keeping in mind the common good. Hardin's original work focused on overgrazing of animals on a commons. And by that, we mean a resource that nobody owns privately, but is accessible to the common, to the general population, if you will. And so he observed the overgrazing of animals on common grassland or rangeland. Very easy to make that connection to overfishing of the world's oceans, a topic that we dig into in one of our next two lessons in Unit 5. The oceans is a commons, and if each individual fishing company says, I'm just taking a little bit, my limited little catch, and we start adding that up with the magnitude of everybody that's doing that, we realize that we are overfishing or using that resource in an unsustainable way. The atmosphere is another good example of a commons, and the amount of photochemical smog and particulates that will endanger the health of future generations. And deforestation, primarily in tropical rainforests, another example of a commons, and we'll dig into this a little bit later in today's lesson. Well, let's take a look then at if we've made this connection between we want to make sure that we use resources at a level that we leave some for future generations. And we know that we as a species tend to sort of think about our own personal needs being fulfilled first without a broader look at the good of the entire population. That's where this idea of sustainable yield comes in. And it's driving us towards some of these solutions or a positive way to look at it. How can we manage renewable resources? Non-renewable resources, I mean, oil is going to be gone someday. We can spread out how long that oil lasts by reducing the amount of it we withdraw, but there's a finite amount of oil on the planet. So when we look at renewable resources, we like to look at them in terms of sustainable yield. We want to determine what's the maximum rate at which I can harvest that natural resource without depleting it. And a really good way of thinking about this is if I look at the carrying capacity of a population and how many if I'm going to set, like, if you're hunt or fish at all, the wildlife biologist each year will do a survey of a deer population, and they'll say, well, here's what our population is, and here's how many deer tags or licenses we need to distribute in order to ensure that we have enough of a stock of deer left that they can quickly rebound and get back up to carrying capacity. So we can really apply this idea of sustainable yield to any renewable resource. Are we using it at a rate that it is going to be able to replenish itself? And again, we're going to look at overfishing and deforestation in a lot of detail now that we've reviewed some of the basic ideas in this first lesson. So let's take a step back and see if we can apply that by looking at a quantitative data set and looking at groundwater withdrawal. Groundwater is another example of a commons. This graph simply shows me from the year 1970 to 2010, the amount of water withdrawal in cubic kilometers per year. It's a volume unit. And I can see that overall, we're withdrawing more water. Let's talk a little bit about some of the details on the graph, and then we'll look at groundwater itself. So they could ask me a simple question to just interpret the graph. Which sector uses the greatest amount of water? You may have known that without looking at the graph, but it's agriculture. And the source of that water, where most of the water for irrigation comes from, is groundwater. Not all of it, but that's where a large source of it's from. You're going to dig into irrigation techniques, I think, tomorrow a little bit more. So what I want to spend a minute on is just kind of talking about groundwater as an example of a commons. You may, I'll go into the color coding here that you probably can't see in a minute, but you may remember talking about the Ogallala Aquifer. It's a big geologic source of water that we tap, groundwater that we tap to grow agricultural crops. And there are other aquifers in other parts of the world that are tapped for growing agricultural crops as well. The majority of the water that fuels the growth of crops in the breadbasket of the United States, where we grow a lot of corn and wheat and soybeans, pretty much all of that comes from the pumping water up from the Ogallala Aquifer. And remember, when we talk about that aquifer, we talk about it as a geologic source of water. The geologic processes that accumulated all that water as like thousands, over the last couple of thousands of years, water percolated down through that soil and saturated or filled the rock below and layers of porous soil. So we now have this big reservoir, this big storage area of water that we can tap. But according to this graph, we're not using that water sustainably. We are withdrawing water at a rate, we are pumping it out faster than, like, snow melt from the Rockies can run down and trickle in and recharge that aquifer or replace what we withdrew, because the rate of withdrawal exceeds the rate of recharge. And these red and orange areas are showing me areas where the aquifer has been very substantially depleted. There is no way that a couple generations from now, there's going to be water left in the Ogallala Aquifer to farm the way that we're currently farming, using the amount of water that we're currently using there. We are using it at an unsustainable rate, which means we are going to prevent future generations from having access to water, potentially having access to water to grow crops. We'll come up with some solutions for that, trust me. So the idea of sustainable use applies to the management of renewable resources. So we've kind of started looking at this idea of agriculture. I'm gonna introduce some of the background information on agriculture, starting with slash and burn, looking at kind of an ancient technique of agriculture that people would use individually on a small scale. Clearing a plot of land to grow enough food for subsistence farming is really the technique that this is used for. So if we were going to describe what slash and burn agriculture is. It's a method of growing food in which we clear often forested land and we burn that vegetation. We slash it, we cut it, and we burn it. Why do we burn it? Well, all the nutrients are stored in the trees. So that ash contains all the nutrients, and I have this rich layer of nutrients on the top of my soil so that I can grow a crop. It happens mostly in developing countries, rainforested areas of Africa, Northern South America, parts of Asia. This map in particular indicates areas that have been slashed and burned for palm oil plantations. That would be an example of a cash crop, or why why slash and burn agriculture is posing such an unsustainable threat. It might be to grow cash crops. It might be to clear pasture land for grazing livestock, or it could be just an individual farmer needing to clear land in the rainforest to grow food for their own family. So the explanation why it's an unsustainable practice, this is where we're going to go back to that tropical rainforest from your soil FRQ that you did for homework. Tropical rainforests do not have a lot of organic matter in their soil. They are very nutrient poor soils. And it seems sort of contradictory. We think, well, look at all the stuff growing in the tropical rainforest. There's got to be nutrients in the soil. But the thing is, tropical rainforests don't ever have a dormant season. They're at the equator, they're getting all that sunlight, lots of precipitation, and they're just growing all the time. In a temperate deciduous forest, like where I live, all that leaf litter falls in the winter, and then nothing's actively growing a lot in the winter. So all that leaf litter gets to slowly decay, and that organic matter builds up over time. That just doesn't happen in a tropical rainforest. The minute something dies, it's decomposed, plants immediately take that up, and we kind of say that all the nutrients are in the trees themselves. That's why when I burn them, the ash has all the nutrients, but this is unsustainable because pretty soon there isn't going to be any nutrients left in that soil. That ash only worked for a couple of years, and now I have a barren piece of land that won't support the growth of anything. We are chopping trees at a rate faster than they can be replenished. So let's take a look at a short video clip that shows you a little bit about what slash and burn agriculture looks like. But we're also going to hear from a farmer that's just trying to do subsistence farming and their point of view, looking at this rainforest and slash and burn in terms of tragedy of the commons.
And we turn now to a story about changing age-old farming practices in the tropics. It's part of the Economist Film Project, a NewsHour collaboration with The Economist magazine. Together, we showcase independently produced documentaries that take us places we don't ordinarily go. Here's an excerpt from Up in Smoke by filmmaker Adam Wakeling. He followed ecologist Michael Hands as he introduced Honduran farmers to the Inga tree, his solution to the problems caused by so-called slash and burn agriculture.
You start the fire there. Okay, this is why we burn. The weeds and the trunks are thick. We can't plant amongst all of that. So we just burn it all. I know this destroys the soils. Fertility disappears. I know this. But there's no other way to eat. Do you understand?
And we
So what we saw there was kind of a classic example of tragedy of the commons. Each individual farmer saying, I have to eat, I have to clear this land to plant a crop. And as the film continues, and tomorrow we'll talk about the solution part of it, we'll come back and look at what solution they're presenting to those Honduran farmers. But he said each year we just go up and clear another couple hectares and we keep spreading out. And then like the next year, even 2 years later, they clear another patch of land. And you get the idea that if everybody's doing that, the magnitude of that means that we're clearing forest at an unsustainable rate. So let's switch gears a little bit and go from that agriculture practice that's used just to feed a small number of people to the Green Revolution. These remarkable breakthroughs that happened in scientific advancements in the 1950s and 60s. The Green Revolution was really spearheaded by this American agronomist, Norman Borlaug. And what he did was the process of selective breeding. And I'm going to take just a minute to explain that so that next when we talk about genetic modification, the difference makes sense to you. Selective breeding is artificial selection. We learned about natural selection, where nature decides through natural changes in the environment, what traits are going to be most advantageous. Well, a plant breeder, an agronomist like Borlaug, selected artificially which traits he thought would create the best wheat plant. And he developed this dwarf variety of wheat plant. You may remember reading about that when you studied the Green Revolution in your class. So instead of having this normal wheat plant that had a lot of energy was going into making the stalk and things like that, he developed this dwarf variety where all of the edible energy went into those kernels. And then the result was just a lot more grain to feed a lot more people. And the results were dramatic. Throughout the 1960s up through the 1990s, similar varieties of rice were developed. Borlaug really focused on the wheat, but the promise and benefits of the Green Revolution were most seen throughout Asia. And in fact, the population, that's because that's where a lot of population increases were happening. Even though the population increased over that period dramatically in Asia, we saw death rates fall and the amount of actual food people were consuming per person go up. I believe it was 1970 that Borlaug won the National Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's credited with saving 1 billion lives through the development of these hybrid type of plants. So the Green Revolution was phenomenal in developing for certain parts of the world that were dealing with rapidly growing populations in saving them and giving them enough food to eat. And that sort of led in the developed world. At the same time, we were developing these techniques of industrial agriculture. So we're just going to kind of introduce and review what we mean by industrial agriculture, and again, dig into the real specifics of that over the next lesson or two. So if I were going to describe or list the characteristics of an industrial agriculture practice, I would have to talk about the scale of it. It's very large scale. It could be, I have a field I'm harvesting anywhere from thousands to 10,000 acres, and it's a monoculture. That implies one variety of crop, often corn or wheat or soy. And in order to understand the implications of a monoculture, think of the Irish potato famine and what happens when we rely on only one type of crop. And the loss of those ancestral varieties of things like wheat and rice and corn are going to be very significant. We'll come back to that in a minute when we look at genetic modification. The next characteristic we have is that it is mechanized. We've really increased output. We've increased the efficiency. I can produce a lot more grain per acre, per unit of land, but that comes at the cost of increased use of fossil fuels. The tilling techniques that are required for many industrial agriculture processes dig deep into the soil. They can damage the soil structure. And more significantly, they're altering that, they're digging through that soil and releasing a lot of carbon. That soil should normally be sequestering vast amounts of carbon, but these tilling techniques often release a lot of that. And back to this idea of fertilizers, large inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus, because they are limiting factors in a terrestrial ecosystem. There is no way that we could ever have kept pace, that food production could have ever kept pace with human population if we didn't supplement the nutrients in the soil in some way in a large scale agriculture practice. And remember, those nitrates and phosphates, NNP, that are plant food, run off and serve as plant food for algal growth. And we get this process of nutrient enrichment where when those algal plants die, the decomposers deplete the oxygen, and we have these huge dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So all of these ways that we just described industrial agriculture are also pointing to signs, those vital signs or environmental indicators that we're doing this at an unsustainable rate. We're using fertilizer, fossil fuels, depleting water resources in such a way that we're jeopardizing the potential for future generations to produce food. Well, scientists often come to the rescue with some solution like that. And one of the things, because we feel that the techniques that we've been using for agriculture over the last couple decades that have shown us those drastic increases in yield, amazing increases in yield, we believe we are maxing out our capability of soil to keep increasing the amount of food we can produce per acre. So next we're turning to genetically modified organisms. Remember, that is not what Borgla did with the agronomist, where he just took the traits of, he looked at the genetics of plants and said, I'm going to take this plant with these traits and this plant with these traits and breed them together to get a new variety that has the best traits. When I genetically modify an organism, I, in a laboratory, create a seed that has, I've altered the genetic makeup of that existing plant. Often that implies inserting a gene from, it could be a completely unrelated species. It could be inserting an animal gene into a plant. Well, why would scientists want to do this? Most of the benefits, and remember early on we said that human impacts have both positive and negative implications. Some of the positives that have come out of genetically modifying seeds is that I can create a seed that will often allow it to overcome some of the other environmental problems we've created. So we have a warmer climate. So I might want to genetically modify a seed that can grow in a warmer climate or a warmer soil. Or we know that there have been changes in precipitation patterns as a result of climate change. Maybe the area where I have typically grown my corn isn't getting as much rain, or it's getting a lot more rain. So I might want to modify its ability in terms of its drought resistance, or maybe more tolerant to salt as soil is becoming salinated. I might also want to modify it to take repeated applications of an herbicide. You may have talked about Roundup Ready in your classroom when you talked about this. So the benefit is that if my seed is genetically modified, the minute my soybean plant emerges, normally I couldn't spray my herbicide because the herbicide couldn't tell the difference between the weed and my soybean plant. I don't want the herbicide to kill my soybean plant, but a Roundup Ready seed will not be killed by spraying that herbicide. So I can continually spray herbicide. The benefit of that is that I increase yield. I have less cross crop loss to weeds. And it could be genetically modified so that it's a built-in pesticide. You may have talked of BT corn. They genetically modify a seed so that it has its own natural pesticide, so that a corn borer insect, for example, may not eat my crop. It would die if it ate it because the insecticide or pesticide is already in there. And I'm not spraying it. That would be the benefit of that, is that it's only in the plant and I don't have the negative consequences of spraying that broad range pesticide. Well, some of the concerns about that, we've created this monoculture. We're losing ancestral varieties of different crops like wheat. And if I want to ultimately create a genetically modified wheat crop, wheat seed that is going to be drought tolerant, I have to have a lot of different kinds of wheat plants to seek out that gene that naturally exists in some wheat plant somewhere and take that gene and insert it into my new wheat plant that I want to genetically modify. So this seems a little confusing at first. How can taking repeated applications of an herbicide be good and bad? Well, it's good in terms of my crop yield. It's bad because I'm spraying a lot of herbicide. And some of those herbicides are persistent organic pollutants that can cause both environmental and human health effects. Built-in pesticide. It's good that I can build that pesticide right into my seed and the farmer doesn't have to spray, but anything that eats that plant could now be affected by that toxin and it could die as well. It might not just be targeting that corn borer insect that I want to kill. There are questions about human consumption of genetically modified foods. There is no current research that shows any direct link between human health problems and eating a food that's been genetically modified. There are certainly environmental implications like loss of natural biodiversity. And many people may have a moral or ethical or religious problem with the genetic modification of an existing species. So let's do a quick check for understanding, a couple multiple choice questions on what we just covered. Which of the following describes a fundamental characteristic of the green revolution in food resources? Question or choice A at first may have looked like it was pretty good, but remember it implies developing a new strain of crop, primarily wheat and rice, that had very high yields. Which of the following statements about genetic diversity is true? And the answer is genetic resistance to pests and diseases can be increased by crossing crop plants with ancestral varieties. And then we have a question here where we're going to look at a graph. This is about glyphosates. They're one of the types of herbicides or weed killers that we've talked about. And they're herbicides often incorporated into a GM crop to kill weeds without harming the crop themselves. So this is what we just talked about. There's a lot going on the graph here. So let's, like we've learned with that I-square technique, break down what's going on. Obviously, my x-axis is time from when we first started using glyphosates up until 2010. But I've got two different axes, two different scales on my y-axis. I have the amount of glyphosate applied in tons, and then my other axis, and that's the solid line. And the other axis is confirmed number of glyphosate resistant weed species. Oh, that's something we haven't talked about yet. We know that plants and animals can develop a resistance. So that's this dotted line right here. And you notice, again, before I even read the question, I want to just take that couple of seconds and do an initial interpretation and make sense of this. So I can see that the use of glyphosate herbicides has increased dramatically. Look at the slope of that line. And I also see that after a little bit of lag time, it appears as if the number of glyphosate resistant weeds increased at a mirror, it's like a mirror image, increased at the same rate after that little bit of lag time. So now let's take a look at the multiple choice question. Which of the following statements best explains the relationship shown on the graph? And letter C is the correct answer. The use of glyphosates has selected for herbicide resistance in weed populations. Now remember, I'm not going to go over a lot of multiple choice taking strategies here, but we did just talk about a lot of environmental concepts and processes. Genetically modified organisms could be used as a solution. You could maybe be asked to talk about some of the pros and cons of that. And certainly one of the disadvantages in this specific instance of genetically modified seeds to take more application of these glyphosate weed killers is that eventually that crop is going to become resistant to that. All right, let's do a little debrief and summary. Go back to that original question that we looked at the beginning. How will Earth systems and processes provide for future generations? So we had those learning targets about what is sustainability and the idea of sustainable yield. We looked at tragedy of the commons and related that to sustainable resource use. We reviewed the Green Revolution, what the Green Revolution was, and how it was able to increase yields, but some of the drawbacks of that. And finally, we just introduced the idea of some different kinds of agriculture practices. And tomorrow you're going to, as I said, you're going to dig into those in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to leave you with your homework. It's a little bit of a shorter assignment. There are 3 task verbs that you're using in this homework assignment tonight. Describe, I think it's an explain how, and identify. And again, before you do this, you may want to take a look at that note-taking skill, because all these FRQs you're writing should be organized in your notes that you can use on the national exam. Let's do a quick preview of the test that your homework, the FRQ you're writing. Figure 1 shows the amount of sediment and runoff in disturbed areas, in areas where clear cutting has disturbed the vegetation in the riparian zone in a stream in Brazil. And again, I've got kind of those 2 different y-axes. Boy, I got to tell you, in a graph, I think it was on last year's exam, in grading that question, it was very clear that students didn't even realize that there were 2 different values represented on each side of that y-axis. So always do your I-squared first: sediment runoff and rainfall. So I've got sediment runoff represented by a bar graph in both non-vegetated and vegetated areas over this period of time measured in days. And then the line graph corresponds the amount of sediment runoff to the rainfall. In other words, what's the relationship between how much rain there is and how much runoff there is in both a disturbed and an undisturbed area. So a couple questions about the graph itself, and then we go into forests as a commons. Thanks for joining me today for the first of the 3 lessons in Unit 5. Have a fabulous Earth Day tomorrow, and I will see you on Thursday. See you guys.